Good evening and welcome to the final installment of the Crossroads of Ideas series for calendar year 2020. My name is Laura Heisler and I am the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the Director of Outreach for the Morgridge Institute for Research, and a partner with the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And these are the three organizations that collaborate to bring you this series. The goal of this series is to address issues that matter to all of us in our lives that also happen to be the subject of research at UW-Madison and the Morgridge Institute. Accordingly, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that the Discovery Building, where this series is normally held, and UW-Madison occupy. That land is Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teydoro since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed, where both the federal and state governments repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. And please join us in uncovering such truths every day. Thank you. I would like to mention a few procedural details about this evening's session before turning the mic over to our moderator. All Crossroads of Ideas events include an opportunity for you as participants to exchange your ideas and ask questions of the presenters. We are using the Q&A function of Zoom. You'll find this by mousing over the bottom of your screen. You can ask your questions at any time, and we will try to answer as many as possible. We're going to conclude our session precisely at 6 p.m. You'll also be able to find a recording of this evening's session as soon as tomorrow at discovery.wisc.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Michael Wagner is a professor in the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Journalism and Mass Communication. His research, teaching, and service are animated by the question, how well does democracy work? He approaches this question from a variety of perspectives, incorporating into his work the study of political communication, political parties, journalism, public opinion, political psychology, political behavior, religion and politics, the presidency, and biology. We could not be in better hands for someone to steward tonight's important conversation. Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for hosting this event and for putting together this event with the three organizations who are partnering to do this. We're delighted to be with you all tonight. In a year where health and democracy took on some new meanings, the 2020 election and its aftermath presented several interesting, new, and some continuing challenges to U.S. democracy. Our election was conducted during a pandemic requiring fundamental changes in how we cast and count ballots. The incumbent president refused to commit in advance to a peaceful transfer of power if he lost, and continues to refuse to recognize his defeat as legitimate, though he has allowed the transition process to begin. All of that has happened in an election where polling places and mail balloting operated effectively and generally uneventfully, despite the unprecedented conditions. And despite the accusations and litigation, there has been no evidence of systematic malfeasance or mismanagement. Put all of that on top of public confidence in our institutions is broadly down, and there are even greater partisan asymmetries in that confidence in our institutions than in past years. When it comes to major institutions in our own state, a survey conducted last month by the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal, which I direct, you'd think I would be able to say it since I direct it, found that partisan differences in the trust of major institutions like police, colleges and universities, lawmakers, legislatures, news organizations, and citizens who live in rural, urban, or suburban areas are all very different. All of this as we manage a global pandemic, renewed attention to racial inequalities, and an upcoming transfer of power at the federal level. Tonight, we will hear from an all-star panel of internationally known experts to help us unpack these issues and think about them critically. And so we are delighted to welcome Barry Burden, Professor of Political Science at UW-Madison. He also directs the Elections Research Center and is the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. Barry's research and teaching are based in American politics, focusing on electoral politics and representation. He is the author of several books, including Why Americans Split Their Tickets, Campaigns, Competition, and Divided good government. He has published an enormous amount in several high-quality academic journals and is affiliated with a variety of departments and other centers on campus. Francisca Coleman is an assistant professor of constitutional law here at the UW Law School and the associate director of the East Asian Legal Studies Center. She's an interdisciplinary scholar, drawing her work upon critical discourse analysis, constitutional law, and political theory. Her research presently is focusing on constitutional implications of the United States' eventual demographic shift into a minority-majority society. She also explores cancel culture as a byproduct of American constitutional choice to rely on social rather than legal regulation of speech, with particular attention to the canceling of speakers who are members of racial or ethnic minorities. Prior to joining us, she's new to the UW Law School, and of course, a strange semester to be new, but Professor Coleman was a visiting assistant professor at WashU in St. Louis and held a visiting scholar appointment at the Harvard Law School. Also, we are delighted to have Kathy Cramer, who not only is a professor and the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science in our political science department, but also got her bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin. She is also a visiting professor, or has been, at the Laboratory for Social Machines at the MIT Media Lab. She's an affiliate member in a variety of centers and departments across our campus and is very well known for her innovative approach to the study of public opinion, where she uses methods like inviting herself into conversations of groups of people to listen to the way they talk about and understand public affairs. She's the author of several books and was named to the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts and Letters in 2018. She's won several awards from the American Political Science Association, including the Heinz Ulau Award for Best Article published in Perspectives on Politics, which was also published with her one of her former graduate students, Ben Toff, who's now a professor at Minnesota, though we don't hold that against him. She also was a winner of the Kellett Mid-Career Faculty Researcher Award and was elected in 2019 to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Lou Friedland is a professor in my department, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and is affiliated in the Department of Sociology. He founded and directs the Center for Communication and Democracy. His research and teaching focus on civic and citizen journalism, communication and society, research methods in communication, international news reporting, and civil society and public life. He's the author of 3 books and one on the way. If only his co-authors like me would get off his back and let him do his work without having to carry us, we would be done. But that book will be coming out at Cambridge University Press later in 2020. Lou's research has been supported by a variety of foundations, including the Ford Foundation, Pew Charitable Trust, the Knight Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, and more. And he also founded and publishes Madison Commons, a hyper-local news organization right here in Madison. Manny Teodoro, also new to our campus this year in the Follette School, a strange semester to begin as an associate professor, but we're delighted to have him here as he works at the intersection of politics, public policy, and public management. His blog at mannyteodoro.com is incredibly fascinating. I was reading a piece yesterday he posted about water policy and the incoming Biden administration, which I recommend people taking a look at. His work focuses on U.S. environmental policy and implementation, including analyses of environmental justice. In addition, he pursues a line of applied research on utility management, policy, and finance, and has also done the hard work of developing novel methods for analyzing a bunch of different important elements of how we understand public administration and bureaucracy in the United States, especially with respect to how these issues deal directly with governments and water sector leaders from across the country. He also studies public management and bureaucratic politics, emphasizing labor markets and political phenomena. That's where his award-winning book, Bureaucratic Ambition, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, comes from as well. So we are delighted to have such a wonderful panel of folks to talk about the health of democracy with you all tonight. And so with that long introduction out of the way, let's go alphabetically and start with Barry Burden. We'll begin with the same question for everybody and then move on to your own areas of expertise. But tell me a little bit about just your general take on the current health of our democratic system here in the United States.
Well, we might treat this the way a physician would treat a patient in judging their health. And my answer would be, your health's pretty good, but there are some real warning signs that need to be checked if we're going to maintain that health. So let me start with the positives, which I think are easier to overlook. We still do have in the United States a vibrant court system and a rigorous separation of powers between the Congress and the presidency. That's still intact. We have a vibrant and free media, especially the investigatory media have really flourished in the last few years. It's been sort of a golden age for high quality national journalism. This year, we saw record voter turnout. About 2/3 of eligible voters participated, which was the highest in a century. And there's been a lot of social movement activity and protest activity this summer that has been, I think, effective in changing or leading, hopefully, to some changes in policing and racial inequality. So there are lots of positive signs. And yet, I think most scholars of the system would agree that there has been backsliding away from democracy over the last several years. These include really some worrisome trends like distrust of the media and insulting the media, distrust of courts, distrust of authorities and institutions, animosity towards the opposing political party, which is now at all-time highs, and that has sort of become ingrained in our identities in a way. It's not just about policy disputes and old-fashioned debates anymore. So I think there are some very serious warning signs that continue to appear, and it's not a trend that we can continue on to maintain the health we all hope the system has.
Thank you, Barry. Same question to Francisca Coleman, the 40,000-foot view of the current health of our democracy in the United States.
Right, yes, I view the patient as in critical need of intervention. I think we in America have always had challenges in terms of the health of our democracy. We've always had a governing group and a group that was the governed. But that division was normally, the governing was pretty broad majority and the governed was, a small minority defined by race and class. But now we actually have the governed and the governing being huge swaths of society, to the extent that each election is kind of a referendum on which half of the country will be the oppressed and which half of the country will be the oppressor. And I think the way we have framed issues has made that particular dynamic very salient in this time. And because of that dynamic, I think there is some hesitancy about democracy and the democratic experiment itself, because we are afraid of our neighbors, right? We are afraid of our neighbors' exercise of the franchise. So if democracy is this government by discussion, this collective we, the people making decisions, we're in a situation where people are really afraid of an inclusive we, the people making decisions, right? They really feel uncomfortable with the other being a part of that decision-making process. And I think if you don't have a commitment to democracy that is inclusive, then it's questionable whether you have a commitment to democracy. And I think the high stakes increasingly make people feel that winning is a matter of kind of their existential, lives. So that when you're facing an existential crisis, abstract ideas like democracy are not as salient and don't matter as much to you as protecting yourself. And so I think the commitment, the sense of threat, right, and the commitment to self-protection, I think is increasingly outweighing, the commitment to ideals that are kind of embedded in the concept of democracy. And so I see this as being kind of a crucial time in our nation to see, can we get over this fear and distrust? Because if we can't, we cannot govern together in any meaningful way.
Thank you for that fascinating way to kick this off. And Kathy, same question to you, general health of our democracy.
Yeah, I'm pretty worried too. I think I absolutely agree. It's a really crucial time. It just seems like it's a moment of reckoning where Barry points about there's signs of pretty positive health in a lot of ways. I mean, the extraordinary turnout and the level of engagement. And yet we're in a really dangerous spot. And I think the divisions among us, those of us in the population, are pretty frightening. But what I find even more frightening these days is just the lack of democratic norms among our leaders. And I reflect back on this book that was published a few years ago in 2018 called How Democracies Die, by Levitsky and Zablat. And they just enumerate for us just historically when democracies have really faltered. It's been largely because of the behavior of elites and their inability to pursue forbearance and mutual toleration of the opposing side. And we see that a lot these days, and just an inability of our political leaders to actually speak about and support the importance of democracy and uphold democratic norms. And without that, we really can't expect members of the public to do any different. And so I'm very worried, and I think this is just a crucial moment in our history in which we really do need our leaders to step up.
Forbearance and mutual toleration of the opposing side are critical elements of civil society, which is Lou Friedland's wheelhouse. So, Lou, same question to you.
Yeah, all the good answers have been taken already, but I do agree with much of what my colleagues have just said. The only thing I would add to that is that I do tend to look at democracy as twinned with civil society, and I see civil society, as do most of my colleagues before me, as fracturing in a variety of different ways. There's a lot to say about that, but I do think that one of the most important norms of a democracy is the ability to come to some sort of common agreement, not on solutions, which is what we have parties for, while we have different opposing policies, but on the fundamental facts, even if not even all the facts, at least the fundamental set of problems that we have. And right now, I think it's fairly clear that in this country, we don't come anywhere close to that level of fundamental agreement. I think that, as I'll say in a little bit, I think we have one part of the electorate, and I know that this is a little bit taboo in these discussions, but I think there's an asymmetry here between the parties. I don't think it's just political leaders. I think there's one, the president himself, his entire party, virtually almost, is refusing to recognize the results of an election. There's been 3 recounts in Georgia, a complete recount in Wisconsin. People have been in courts multiple times, and yet, despite assertions of fraud, not one instance, literally not one instance of actual fraud has been asserted. So when you have that kind of epistemic gap between the parties, and you have identity politics that then picks up on that gap between the parties, I think it's very, very hard to have a functioning democracy or democratic norms that will hold the society together. So I do think we're in a state of fracture.
So we've heard from the political scientists, mass communication sociologist, and the law professor. We also can think about this from a perspective of public administration, public policy. And so, Manny, Teodoro, same question to you, or general democratic health as you see it.
Yeah, I'd say, echoing many of the themes here, tough. I to stick with the health metaphor. We're going through a stress test here. Some hooked up to those electrodes and pumping hard. It's a stress test the likes of which we've not seen in many, many decades. The metaphor I keep thinking of is the 1919, 1920 period of time when we had a global pandemic. We had vast labor and racial strife, unemployment and housing problems following the First World War, a loss of legitimacy, serious radical movements on both left and right, stoking violence. It's a very similar situation right now, it seems, the breakdown of civil society, so on. It seems like the institutions of the Republic seem to be holding together. Our patient is alive, right, and doing okay, but definitely stressed, definitely strained. And, from a public management perspective, systems are still working, maybe not working at their optimal, but they're functioning. The mechanisms of the state are still functioning. Medical researchers are not paid to declare that a disease is incurable. And so I'm pleased to be among other scholars who are working on ways to help this patient survive and maybe thrive in the future.
Thank you all for a great beginning. I want to start with Francisca Coleman. A few of us now have talked about some stress tests our democracy is under, and you mentioned in your opening remarks a little bit about ways that representation has not been equal across a variety of groups between the governed and the governors over the course of our history. And one of those areas of stress really relates to policing. And so I'm curious about how you would describe connections between the democratic legitimacy of our nation and kind of the various protests you've seen around police brutality around the country over the last several months and years.
Yeah, so I think if we kind of go back to a kind of Lockean idea, right, that people enter society in order to secure, their lives, their liberties, and their property, right? And one of the ways that they do that is by giving, society, the government, a monopoly on the use of force, but that monopoly is kind of controlled, right, and subject to laws that are co-created by the people. So one way to consider democratic legitimacy within the context of policing is to answer two questions, right? One question is, which groups in society are, subject to having their life, liberty, and property taken away by the state? Like which groups are kind of experiencing that on a regular basis, right? And then the second question is, to what extent do those groups that are experiencing this state deprivation on a regular basis, to what extent can they be considered the co-creators, the co-authors of the norms and laws that govern those deprivations? And the answer that the protests, right, and the protesters give is one, that one of those groups that is disproportionately subject to deprivation by the state are African Americans. And two, they are not the ones that have any kind of voice in making these laws and policies, particularly not on the local level, right? So you think, where do these norms come from? They come from the Supreme Court, they come from, policing unions, and maybe you might have some citizen council norms thrown in there. Well, we know from the Supreme Court, they cannot be considered to be co-authoring norms with, the inhabitants of highly surveilled communities. We know that just by some of the decisions that they've given. You think of McCleskey versus Kemp, which, many citizens in highly surveilled communities are very concerned about disparate impact. And the, Supreme Court has said disparate impact is constitutionally irrelevant, right? And then you have, Graham versus Connor, right? Where it says, what's reasonable in terms of these deprivations. The norms are decided not by what's reasonable to the victims, very much a concern for these communities, which are often the victims, but actually what's reasonable, what's lawful is determined by the discretion of the police officer. And so whatever they think is reasonable is okay. And so when you have these norms that are created to the exclusion of the community and of the public, then you don't have any meaningful co-authorship. And if you think about where do the policing policies come from, who makes them, right? There's not a democratic process, the community consultation to decide whether chokeholds will be used, right? Or whether you can shoot someone at a traffic stop. Like there's no community consultation. Instead, a lot of these policies flow from private companies like Lexipol who make the policies, or they're through some internal process that police have been hesitant to share with the community because the community might be criminals and they will get our trade secrets, right? So far from being co-authoring these policies and norms, sometimes the community doesn't have access to them at all, right? And so when you have this use of force that is unregulated by the communities that are subjected to that force, then you have a huge problem with democratic legitimacy. And you end up with outcomes that defeat the entire purpose that we assume to be the reason people entered into society. And so that creates this sense of illegitimacy that leads people to be in the street, because like, why did we enter into society? The society itself is the one that's taking away our lives, liberty, and property, and we have no control whatsoever over when that happens, how that happens, and whether that's justified.
That's a fascinating treatment of how we think about norms. And another norm, this is for Barry, that we have. Although I should say, if people have other things they would like to add, they should feel free to jump in. I've got an either/or question where you can reject the premise of the question if you like, Barry. But we're in an era where our country has always been a country where the norm is when you lose. You engage in a peaceful transfer of power without much complaint. But my question is: are the court cases, news conference tweets pursuing claims of a fraudulent election good for democracy? Yeah, in terms of following an orderly set of processes that gives the president every opportunity to have his concerns heard, vetted, and adjudicated, or is the complete lack of evidence that Lou pointed out in his opening comments that the president and his team have presented so far, turning election administration and the counting of votes in a free and fair election into a partisan sideshow, crippling our faith in our ability to hold elections in the first place?
Well, it's certainly a sideshow that is lowering levels of confidence in the system among Trump's core supporters and cementing that lack of confidence. This has been a theme that Trump has hit for the last 5 years, really, since he began running for office in 2015. So the foundation has been laid and it was escalated going into the election and has been a sole focus of his since the election. So this is different from the normal sour grapes that the losing side usually feels after an election. Often the losers will report in surveys, they're a little less confident in the system, they don't trust it quite as much, and the winners will feel a little better. This is sort of like believing when you're watching a sporting event that the ref is calling fouls against your team more than the other team. I think that's a natural inclination, but that we've gone to a new level here. And unfortunately, people's beliefs about the system, their lack of confidence, is driven by the unfounded assertions that the president and his allies are making. So it becomes this kind of vicious cycle that is detached from facts and from reality. Yes, any losing candidate should have the right to hear their arguments in court, and we've been through about 45 or 50 cases just in the last 3 to 4 weeks. So I think that has been done. I think one thing to remember is that when Donald Trump was a businessman in New York, his job was to skirt around the law and try to get real estate deals done. So things like zoning laws and contracts, those were a nuisance to his success. And as president, strangely, he's continued that behavior of the laws are really in his way, even though we normally expect, we have to have executives and elected officials whose job is to enforce the law. It is the executive branch, after all. And even today, after the election has been settled, I think his attitude is part of that continuing view that the structures we put in place to govern ourselves in the Lockean way that Franciska mentioned are hindrances to his success. And I guess I worry more about his allies who are not standing up to Trump's messages more than I do his final words on the way out of office. A party that can't govern itself to keep its fringe elements in check is dangerous.
I want to follow up, I think, with Lou next to maybe ask, building off of that, what have you seen as some of the key fractures in civil society over the past decade, and how do they relate to some of these problems we've been talking about?
Well, I think some of them are pretty well known to anyone who's been, reading the papers, watching even a moderate amount of news. Kathy, Professor Cramer, has written about one of the most fundamental ones, which is the fracture between rural America and urban America. And urban America can, of course, represent many, many different people, different kinds of people, as does rural America too. But predominantly, when we think of rural America, we often are thinking about white conservative rural Americans. And certainly in terms of the geographic distribution of our politics, there's a great deal of evidence to show that that's the case. I'm blanking for the moment on the precise number of counties that Joe Biden won. I believe it was actually fewer than Hillary, and I think that it was roughly a sixth of the counties in the United States.
I think it was 1% more. I think it was 17% or something like that of the nation's counties.
Right. So broadly, the point is that it's roughly it's a 5.5 to 1 ratio of counties, and of course, our system is built on geography. whether we like it or not. Our Senate's built on geography, our local legislatures and state legislatures are built on geography. And so that schism is a schism that runs throughout the entire body politic. Now, it may be one that I like or don't like. If I'm a Democrat, I probably don't like it. And I would prefer to see a mass popular vote. And I would prefer to see reforms to the Senate and so on. But of course, that's the paradox of our democracy right now. We have disproportionate rural and small state power, and rural and small state citizens or electors, voters have to agree, as it were, to give up some of that power. And of course, that's not likely to happen. So we have a kind of stasis right now. And I think that that runs through civil society. The other great divide, which parallels this one, is besides the asymmetry of our politics, Republicans and Democrats, we have the asymmetry of our media systems, which again is familiar to most people. But ever since certainly the 80s, 88, I believe, when Rush Limbaugh came online, we have tens of millions of people who live via talk radio and via Fox News into a relatively closed ecosystem right now. And great scholar at Harvard Law School, Yochai Benkler, just wrote a book called Network Propaganda that outlines the differences between the two media systems, one bluntly being fact-based and one basically being based upon largely dis and misinformation. And so I think that when you have that fundamental divide in the media diet of Americans, it's not surprising that 25% roughly of Americans believe in a QAnon conspiracy that would say that leading Democrats are pedophiles, for example, or that 70%, depending upon the poll of Republicans, believe that the election was rigged. So when we have that level of schism in civil society, which is, I would say, epistemic, it's a problem of knowledge, it's hard to see how we can resolve or reconstitute our democratic norms, even if those institutions, as most of my colleagues have said, are kind of holding things together in the short, medium run.
So there's a lot of kind of broad characterizations of statistical evidence in Lou's answer that show some pretty troubling ways of thinking about how we manage the current state of our democracy. And Kathy, I'm curious, given the way you do your work, what are you learning about how people are experiencing and encountering these different kinds of divisions? So I mean, it's critical for us to be able to say X% of people think the election turned out this way or that, or have faith in this institution or that. But how are people experiencing these things and reasoning among themselves about what it means to live in this time?
They seem to be experiencing them in very isolated ways from each other, right? Which just reinforces the divisions. We hear about these divisions and process them within our own pods, right? Within our own sort of narrow social circles for most of the time. And I think we're also, we tend to be paying attention to the elites that we trust, who are also reinforcing these divides for us, which, not to be all doom and gloom, but it's difficult. It makes it very difficult to get out of them. And I would also say, just reflecting on Lou's comments, that we've had difficult moments in the past in terms of divisions, and both within Wisconsin and within the country. But I think what's unique about this time is partly the communication system that Lou's been talking about, and the way in which so many of our important divides are lining up all at once. So we have these geographic divides, partisan divides, racial injustice is just front and center, and all those things we've had in the past, but they're lining up together along with just incredible economic inequality. So when we think back to some of the really difficult times in Wisconsin, for example, thinking about the civil rights era, just thinking about the the march across the 16th Street Viaduct in Milwaukee that turned violent, the spearfishing treaty rights protests in the 80s, which were a horrible point in time for us as a state. Just on our own campus, right, during the Vietnam War. I mean, the protests, the extreme cultural clashes between students and law enforcement officers, for example. All those things were occurring at a time when we did not have the extreme economic inequality that we have right now. So just to put it more concretely, I mean, the Wisconsin Budget Project out of the Center on Wisconsin Strategy showed, I think it was last year, that, you know, since 1973, the top 1% of income earners in the state, their income has tripled since 1973. The rest of us, our income has grown about 18%. That's just one factoid to say, like, in the background of all of this, a lot of people are struggling for just daily basic needs. And I think that just makes the divides worse. And it just makes us all want to blame each other even more.
A lot of this makes me think about trust in general. And Manny, Teodoro, you know, when we talk about problems and trust, distrust can be rational, right? When it responds to what it is, people are experiencing. And so what ways is our distrust rational?
Sure. I mean, distrust is entirely rational. In fact, we're sort of the evolutionary psychologists tell us that we're sort of wired to be distrustful, especially of new and different things. Look, people see their own lives getting worse, or don't, at least not seeing prospects for improvement. They're seeing the kinds of patterns that Kathy just talked about with income inequality. I think about folks like the rural poor who see their community struggling, shrinking in many cases, basic services collapsing. And I want to add an addendum. Here in Wisconsin, we may associate rural with the racial connotation to rural is white, but I want to emphasize in other parts of the country that's not the case. I just moved here from Texas. Texas, rural means generally Mexican American. In the black belt of the southern states, we associate rural with Black communities and American Indian communities in other parts of the country. So we want to be careful about oversimplifying that. But we see those rural communities struggling. Their distrust of the system is rational when they see massive aid going to storm victims in New York City and nothing to their own communities when they're beset by natural disasters. They learn distrust. We're on the cusp of getting a COVID vaccine, we all hope, but it's entirely understandable that large sections of the African American and American Indian communities are going to be a little distrustful of the medical establishment. That's not stupid. That's not paranoia. That's learned behavior, and that's entirely rational. So rebuilding that trust has to begin with government doing better for everyone, doing better for everyone in visible ways, and in ways that cut across some of those identities. As Kathy was talking, I thought about, Madison's Federalist 10 was telling us that a big republic was going to solve this problem of factions like lining up against each other. What Madison didn't anticipate was social media and a fragmented media environment, and then that was going to cause people at an epistemic level to just not even accept the reality of the other sides of the political spectrum. So the distrust is real, it's rational, but we can also do something about it.
I want to stick with Manny for a second. On the list of things Americans list as exciting, bureaucracy tends not to be something that gets listed. And yet, in some ways, I know it's a terrible thing to say to a professor at a Follette school, but in some ways, we can think of our bureaucracy as the thing that's held us together. What can we learn from what bureaucracy is doing right?
Yeah, I think back to the opening days of the Trump administration, late in January in 2017, just a few days after the president had taken office. He issued an order. I imagine many people remember this. He issued an order banning refugee entry into the United States, and that included a specific travel ban from a handful of predominantly Muslim countries. That was challenged almost immediately in court, and a district court judge issued an injunction against that order. And I held my breath at that moment, kind of wondering what was going to happen, because we had a moment where federal bureaucrats in the immigration services, immigration authorities, had to choose between an executive order from the president and a court order from the courts. The answer is the bureaucracy followed the court's orders. And I exhaled and I thought, well, maybe democracy is going to live another day because of the bureaucracy. I've been profoundly disappointed by congressional leaders and their unwillingness to challenge the president, not just this president, the last several presidents, in abuses of their authorities and gradual expansions of their authorities. What we've seen, I think, in a lot of ways, is the bureaucracy holding this country together. Our crazy, fragmented electoral system. Everyone's going nuts on election night with how slow the bureaucracy was working. Well, it's slow, it's fragmented, but it's ultimately working. The votes get counted. They get recounted. They get recounted. And this crazy fragmented bureaucratic system that we have in this country, it's inefficient, it's slow, it's unwieldy, but it's also really hard to hack, right? It's very hard for a foreign leader, let alone a domestic leader, let alone a foreign leader, to manipulate our electoral system because it's so fragmented. So the sheer inertia of the administrative state in many ways is a guard against the excesses of politics. Even if any given president or Congress wanted to change things, the bureaucratic inertia is stiff. That makes governing hard, but it also makes the republic a little more stable.
So if bureaucracy is playing this role of responsible management, even against or pushing back against some of the things that are happening in politics, Barry Burden, political parties have not earned high marks in how they've managed themselves in recent years. What can intermediaries that connect us to our government, like political parties, do to responsibly manage themselves going forward?
Yeah, political parties are the glue that connect citizens to their government, right? They structure elections, they organize political debate in Washington, they create pathways to power. And so they have a role in governing themselves to keep fringe elements at bay. These are big catch-all parties compared to parties in other countries. And so they tend to be kind of polyglots with lots of different elements that don't always make sense together. And they tend to be really flexible, being able to adapt to times. But somehow you've got to be flexible and yet not susceptible to, again, fringe elements or dangerous ideas. There's an old story, which I think is true, about the conservative columnist William Buckley in the early 70s, one of the founders of the National Review and a lot of right-wing think tank organizations. He was helping to police what was happening in the Republican Party, which at the time had some infiltration from anti-Semitic groups, conspiracy theorists, segregationists, and others. He wasn't entirely successful in that, and he wasn't entirely consistent in that, but he did draw a line at some places in saying those are not things that are acceptable ideas in our party. And the Democrats have danced with some of these kind of fringe elements at times, segregationists and racial bigots, probably most prominently, but also anti-vaxxers and others have kind of been on the edges of the party. Parties have this kind of honor system to live by. So much of our democracy is based on the honor system, and parties are too. I think one of the most troubling trends these last few years has been what many people have called whataboutism, where when you identify a flaw or misstep or something you disagree with on the other side, on your side, it's identified with you, you point to something on the other side that seems as bad or worse. What about them? What about that guy? And that's shifting blame and avoiding responsibility, and kind of feeds into the media separation that others have already talked about tonight. So I think parties play a really important role. The trouble is they're not governed by law, they're governed by norms and adherence to values. And right now the parties aren't equally attached to those.
A lot of what both Barry and Manny just had to say makes me think about the importance of norms, but it also makes me think about how important it is for us as citizens to understand how things work. And so, Franciska, I want to ask, I know you've thought a little bit about this, part of the furor over our election that, flowed from just a general lack of understanding about how electoral processes work. And so do you see a connection, or how would you describe the connection, if there is one, between maybe the decreased decreased emphasis we've had on civic education and the current state of our democratic health?
Yeah, I think at a basic level, right, one of the things that we want is for everyone to support our democratic ideals. But if people don't know what those democratic ideals are because they've never sat down and talked about them and like had exposure to them, in a non-partisan way, then how can we expect them to defend that? The way most people learn about American democracy is when partisans pick out one or two aspects and say, because this is true about American democracy, we win, right? And that's all they know. And if we're losing, that means democracy is broken, right? And so once you equate everything you know about democracy is only those things that lead to the outcome, right? And the process itself and the value of the process is never kind of discussed in a way, then you're not going to have people putting norms above outcomes, right? Because and we know, right, that Americans are amazingly, stressingly ignorant of basic information about democracy. Like I read somewhere that only about 25% of Americans can even identify the three branches of government, right? So so these people who don't even know the three branches, are they really going to be able to understand the balance between the president and Congress, the balance between the Supreme Court? They don't even know those other branches exist. To them, if all they know is that the president has power and these checks and balances are something that's unknown, then we can't expect them to kind of hold these various institutions accountable when they don't even know what their role is. They don't even know why they exist, right? And I think that we look at democracy and we feel, oh, democracy is as strong as its institutions. That's not true, because the institutions are only as strong as the people's support of those institutions and their confidence in those institutions. And so it doesn't matter if you have the appearance of these institutions, if people don't know that they're valuable, you're going to lose that popular support for those institutions. And it's only a matter of time before the utility and usefulness of those institutions has been degraded.
When we think about the dynamic relationship between what people know and what they want and our institutions, it seems to place a pretty important role on bureaucratic policies that Manny talked about, but also just on elite behavior, which Kathy touched on at the very beginning of our conversation together, saying that what our elites do is really important. So I guess I'll start with you, Kathy. What are some of the most important things our lawmakers, our institutions can do to help improve the state of democracy?
I go back again to norms and just acknowledge that, humans can do some pretty horrible things to each other, and we do have this tendency toward division. But humans can also be really good to one another, and we also have a tendency towards community, and we're probably feeling that, especially now in this pandemic, in which we're missing time with our loved ones and our neighbors and just people, right? And so I think a really important thing that our leaders can do is to emphasize that aspect of human nature, as opposed to, I'll put it very bluntly and say, we talk a lot about hate and division these days. And that is one thing that you can emphasize as a political leader. But you could also emphasize love. And I know that sounds weird to talk about in a forum like this, but I think it's weird that we don't actually talk about love as much as we talk about hate these days, and hate in our political culture. And I think, and by love, what I mean is talking about the way in which we all benefit by nurturing our relationships with one another and being good to one another and trying to get along. And it's, the sort of the glue that holds things together that Barry was talking about. It is this stuff that's not necessarily about an institution or about a policy, but about what humans choose to value and what we choose to focus on. And that's where my mind goes with our political leaders these days. Like it is a choice to emphasize hate over love.
In some research done out of the center, Lou, Kathy, and I have done some work together, and we found in 2018 that 25% of Wisconsinites said they literally ended a friendship or a family relationship over political disagreements. In 2020, we asked people if they've restarted a relationship that they had ended over politics, and 10% said that they had. And so there was, there's a little bit of a change in the positive there. And Lou, what I want to ask you is, what are some of the elements of the communication ecology that you were describing in your earlier comments that promote a re-knitting together of the civic fabric?
Well, the first one, and it's actually it's sort of obvious, but it's fact-based journalism. It's communication or media that actually are based upon traditional journalistic norms of reporting, including reporting conflict or conflicts over the facts on the ground, but institutions that actually do adhere to norms, journalistic norms, which we've been talking a lot about norms, journalistic norms of truth and fact-based reporting. Now, one problem is that the most central institution historically that has done that is the newspaper, both nationally and locally. And as many people know, newspapers are in a lot of trouble. They are shrinking. They're both shrinking in quality. They're shrinking in quantity. Sometimes they're disappearing altogether from communities. And so we need more fact-based reporting to knit our lives together. Franciska was talking a few minutes ago about people not knowing about the 3 branches of government, which of course is entirely true, but imagine most people have not the vaguest idea who their local assembly, their state representative is, or who their state senator is. And yet our states make tremendous amount of law and policy. Without local newspapers, there's almost no hope that they will know. So the short answer is, the institutions that do that the most or the best, Mike, are disappearing. Social media, which is partly filling the void, is basically designed for conflict, designed to reflect our social, as Kathy was saying, our basic network, our basic social networks that are different, heterogeneous. And so people who've thought seriously about this, I think, are really come back to how would we recreate some fact-based common ground journalism out of the welter of different, largely social media and internet-driven enclaves that exist right now. And it's a very hard thing to do.
So with our remaining 7.5 minutes, I'll try to play a lightning round with everyone. First, this comes from one of the audience questions, and I'm trying to recast it in a way just to be sensitive to time. What's one prediction you have for the next 12 months about how something you've talked about is likely to play out in the United States? We'll start with Barry. Sorry, Barry.
Well, I guess I'll raise a concern, which is the attachment of Republican elected officials in the Congress in particular to Donald Trump that I thought would end when he was defeated. The kind of willing embracing of misinformation, I thought was a result of being on the same team and fear of the president. But now that he's leaving office and will not be a central figure in the party, it's surprising, it's worrisome to me that this appears to be an ongoing element within one of the major political parties. So my prediction is, unfortunately, this is going to continue for some time.
Francisca Coleman, a prediction for the next year.
Yes, I talked about kind of the fear of the other and the democratic kind of power or autonomy of the other being a major driver of polarization. And I think as demographics change, right, the other, or we consider the other may, the kind of representation of the other may increase in society. And I think that we're going to see heightened polarization because you have an idea that America looks like me, right? And once America doesn't look like you, that can be a threat. And that can make your attachment to democracy, I think, lessen. And so I think we'll see more resort to the courts for a lot of decisions. Like a lot of the people who were like states' rights and federalism may instead, just from fear of changing norms, resort more and more to the courts.
That fits in well with an excellent book called Who Counts as an American by Beth Tice Morse, which looks at the different boundaries people set on who they believe counts in our society. Same question to Lou, prediction for the next coming year. You're muted, my friend. So maybe the prediction is silence.
I realized that when it said I was muted on the screen. I think a lot's going to depend upon what happens in Georgia, to be perfectly honest. If there's a bare Democratic majority in the Senate, I think, setting aside whether you're Republican or Democrat, a lot will depend upon whether we can have effective governance to address the pandemic, which is, of course, the very first and most important issue of life, liberty, and security in the United States right now. And of course, it disproportionately affects people of color and lower income people in the United States. If that can be effectively addressed, perhaps some of the temperature can be lowered. If that can be done in the context of a major effort to rebuild infrastructure, for example, that would provide broad jobs for Americans of different races and particularly working people, I have some hope that we might be able to inch forward. Otherwise, I think we will see the kind of scorched earth resistance by Mitch McConnell in the Senate that will make what Obama faced look like a picnic.
Manny Teodoro, prediction for the next year.
Yeah, for me, predictions are mostly opportunities to look foolish in the future. I'll
never
offer.
Turn those down, Manny.
I will offer this up. I think picking up on some of the earlier themes. Look, there's an opportunity with norms to return to some better ideas, some better norms. Look, we could look back in a few years on this period of time as anomalous, or it could be the new normal. Whatever else you might agree or disagree with the presidencies of Bush 43 and Obama, they were people who were sincerely trying to connect with broad swaths of the public. They were not trying to play to an intense minority, either of those presidents. And it could be that we have a president who, in the coming administration, and hopefully a Congress, who are going to follow that suit, and we'll maybe look back on this as a weird thing that happened. But on the other hand, we could see a continuation and a deepening. What I don't see is a lot of change to the incentive structures that sort of drive this polarization. Look, political elites aren't stupid. They're following their incentives. And at some point, political elites need to recognize that the immediate incentives in front of them undermine norms of democracy. And unless and until that happens, we are probably going to continue to see an erosion.
Kathy, I should also offer you the opportunity to look foolish and make a prediction about the next year.
Thanks. Well, I'll try not to be foolish, but I'll just build on what Manny said. And I think that this is it's a crucial time in which there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Biden administration for retribution and revenge against the Republicans. And the incentives are for him to do exactly that, unfortunately. And so I say it's a crucial time because what we all need as a country is for President-elect Biden and his administration to act in the opposite, and instead to take the high ground and treat his enemies with some love.
To that end, I'll plug a piece coming out tomorrow in the Washington Post that a few of us and other folks at the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal put together about ways Democrats might consider framing their agenda going forward to achieve some of the things that were being discussed here. But this does kind of get us to the end of our time together. I'm so grateful to Manny Teodoro, Lou Friedland, Kathy Cramer, Francisca Coleman, and Barry Burden for their expertise and their willingness to engage in this discussion. And I'll turn it over to Laura with a brief announcement before we wrap for the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Fantastic job moderating, Mike. Thank you so much. And we are so fortunate to have these amazing experts. Thanks to all of you for joining. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we really appreciate your participation. I want to let you know again that the video from today's session will be available at discovery.wis.edu under videos. And we will come back in January with another Crossroads of Ideas session, and we'll send you an email about that in a few weeks. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a happy and healthy holiday season. Be well. Thank you so much.